grand piano had silenced 11 players that afternoon, and not one of them had made it past the second movement before walking off the stage of the Harrington Concert Hall with their heads down. Then a girl in a thrift store coat and split sneakers walked up the side aisle toward the stage, and the man at the podium saw her coming and leaned into his microphone. "Sweetheart, the freight elevator's around back if you're here to clean." 400 people laughed. The girl did not stop walking. She climbed the 5 steps to the stage, sat down at the 9-foot Steinway that had defeated 11 conservatory-trained pianists, and by the time the lobby clock struck 9, she would walk out of that hall with a check for $200,000 and a recording contract she never asked for. But that comes later. Let's go back to the morning. Her name was Daniela Reyes, and she was 26 years old. And on the morning of the competition, she was scraping burnt cheese off a flat-top griddle at a diner on Lamar Boulevard in Austin, Texas. She'd been there since 4:30. She was always there since 4:30. The Bluebird Diner did not pay much, but it paid in cash on Fridays, and cash on Fridays was the only kind of money Daniela could plan a life around. Her hands were fast, and her hands were burned in 3 places from the fryer, and when she wiped them on her apron, she did it without looking, the way a person does a thing 10,000 times until the body stops asking permission. The radio above the milkshake machine had been talking about the Harrington Prize all week. $200,000 to any pianist, professional or amateur, who could perform Rachmaninoff's Third Concerto's opening cadenza, and the list that followed. Live in front of a panel of judges and a paying crowd, without a single stop. The Harrington family had been doing it for 6 years. 6 years, and nobody had taken the money. 11 players had tried this year alone. The piece was a wall. People came to watch them hit it. Daniela had not planned to enter. She told herself that 3 times while she flipped eggs, and 3 times it was a lie. The truth was folded into the front pocket of her apron, a printout she had made at the public library 2 weeks earlier. The entry form, already filled in, already signed. She had been carrying it for 14 days the way some people carry a photograph of someone they lost. Marcus, the line cook who worked beside her, was the only one who knew. He was 19, and he believed in her in the simple, total way that only the young can believe in anything. 6 months back, his car had died in the diner lot on a Sunday, with the temperature near 100, and Daniela had popped the hood, listened for 9 seconds, and reseated a corroded ground cable with the back of a butter knife. He'd tried to give her $20. She closed his hand around it and pushed it back. "Pay it to somebody else someday," she'd said. He had not forgotten. Every morning since, he'd left a coffee with 2 sugars by her station before she clocked in, and he never said a word about it. That morning, Marcus saw the corner of the entry form sticking out of her apron, and he looked at the clock, and he looked at her, and he said, "It starts at 1. You're done at 11. You're going." It wasn't a question. Daniela said she didn't have anything to wear. Marcus said nobody was looking at her clothes. Both of them knew that was the other lie in the room, but he said it kindly, and she let him. To understand why a fry cook had Rachmaninoff folded in her apron, you have to go back further than the diner, further than Austin. You have to go to a town in the Rio Grande Valley, and a woman named Daniela Reyes, who cleaned 3 churches a week and who had a daughter with hands that wouldn't sit still. There was no money for a piano. There was money, barely, for the bus that ran past the Methodist church on Tuesdays, and the church had a piano nobody used on Tuesdays, and the pastor was an old man who liked the company of the sound. So from the time Daniela was 5, her mother dropped her at that church with a sandwich and a workbook, and the girl taught herself on a piano with 2 dead keys, learning to hear the notes that weren't there. By 12, she could play anything she heard once. By 15, a traveling adjudicator passed through, heard her, and arranged a full scholarship to a conservatory in the north. She went. For 2 years, she was the poorest student in every room and the best player in most of them. And that combination does not make a person popular. She practiced when the others slept, because the practice rooms were free at night. She worked the dining hall to cover what the scholarship didn't. And in her 3rd year, her mother got sick, the kind of sick that doesn't wait, and there was nobody else, and Daniela came home. The conservatory held her spot for 1 semester, then a second, then sent a kind letter that meant no. Estella died in the spring. Daniela was 21 and alone and $300 in debt for the funeral home's least expensive box, and the only paid work she could find that started the next morning was the breakfast shift at the Bluebird. She took it. She told herself it was temporary. 5 years is a long temporary. She had not touched a real piano in those 5 years. She played on a paper keyboard she'd drawn on a length of butcher paper and taped to her kitchen table, silent, her fingers moving over inked keys at midnight while the refrigerator hummed. She kept her ear alive on the diner radio and on the free recitals at the university when she could slip in. The music lived in her hands whether or not anyone could hear it. That was the thing nobody knew. That was the thing she carried. The Harrington Concert Hall sat on a hill above the river, all glass and limestone, with valets out front and a fountain that cost more to run each month than Daniela earned. She took the city bus. She walked the last half-mile in the heat in her work shoes because the dress shoes she'd borrowed pinched, and she carried those in a plastic grocery bag and changed in the restroom off the lobby, while a woman in pearls watched her in the mirror and said nothing and somehow said everything. The man at the podium was Preston Harrington III. He was 34, and he had inherited the hall, the family foundation, the seat on 3 boards, and a face that had never once been told no by anyone who mattered to him. His grandfather had built the foundation to bring music to people who couldn't afford it. Preston had turned it into a spectacle that brought paying people to watch other people fail. He wore a tailored charcoal suit and a watch that he angled toward the light when he spoke. He liked the competition best when nobody won, because a winner cost $200,000 and a loser cost nothing, and gave the crowd a story about how impossible his family standard was. By 8:45 that night, 11 players had gone and 11 players had broken. A doctoral candidate from a famous school had made it the furthest, deep into the list, before his hands locked and he stood up mid-phrase, bowed stiffly to the silent judges, and left without looking back. The hall had that particular restlessness of a crowd that has watched too much losing. People were checking their phones. 2 of the 5 judges had begun murmuring to each other. Preston felt the room cooling under him the way a host feels a party dying, and Preston had spent his whole life refusing to let a room cool. He stepped to the microphone to announce the close of entries. That was when Daniela stood up from the back row. She had been sitting there in the borrowed shoes for 4 hours, watching, listening, learning the action of that specific piano from 40 rows back, the weight of its keys and how the others' phrases bloomed or choked. She had filled out the walk-up entry slip during the second intermission and handed it to a bored usher who had not looked at her twice. Now she walked down the side aisle, and the late evening light through the west windows caught the worn places on her coat, and 400 people turned to look at a young woman who plainly did not belong in a room with a fountain out front. Preston watched her come. He saw the coat. He saw the plastic bag still clutched in her left hand because she'd had nowhere to put it. He saw a story he could use, a way to warm the room back up at someone's expense, and he reached for it the way he reached for everything, without thinking it might cost him. "Sweetheart," he said into the microphone, "the freight elevator's around back if you're here to clean." The laugh that followed was big and ugly and grateful, the laugh of a bored crowd handed something to do, but it didn't catch everywhere. In the third row, a woman named Ruth Calloway, 70 years old, who had taught public school music for 40 years on a salary that never once felt like enough, set her program down on her knee and did not laugh. Beside her, a young usher named Theo stopped smiling, and up in the press box, a freelance music critic named Joanna Pike, who had been laid off from the city paper in the spring and was covering the night for a website that paid in exposure, leaned forward and started recording on her phone, because something in the girl's walk had told her this was not going to be what Preston thought it was. Daniela reached the foot of the stage. She did not answer him. She set the plastic bag down by the first step, very carefully, like it held something breakable, and it did. It held her work shoes, and those shoes were the truest thing she owned. Then she climbed the steps. Preston covered the moment the way men like Preston always do, by making it a bigger joke. "Folks, looks like we have a walk-up. Now the rules are the rules. The foundation doesn't discriminate." He let the words sit there, smiling. "Miss, do you have a name for the program, or should I just put down surprise?" "Reyes," she said, one word. Not ma'am, not sir, not ma'am, not Ms. or Harrington. The missing politeness was louder than anything she could have added. "Reyes," He turned it over like he was checking it for value. "And what'll you be playing for us, Miss Reyes? We've got a piano up here that's humbled some of the finest schools in the country tonight. You sure you wouldn't be more comfortable with something simpler? There's a nice upright in the rehearsal room. Might be more your speed." A pocket of the crowd laughed again. Ruth Calloway in the third row stood up. She did not shout. She said in the carrying voice of a woman who had quieted 30 years of classrooms, "Let the girl play, Preston. That's enough." Preston's smile tightened at the corners. He was not used to his name said like that, flat, like a correction. The woman beside Ruth stood too, then a man 2 rows back, in the feed store cap that had no business in a concert hall, stood without quite knowing why, only that he'd been a boy once who got told he didn't belong somewhere, and the memory had stood him up before his mind caught up. 3 people standing in a hall of 400. It was nothing. It changed the air completely. Preston raised both hands. "All charm again. Easy, easy. Of course she plays. We're all friends here." He gestured at the Steinway with a flourish and stepped back from the microphone. "The stage is yours, Miss Reyes. The cadenza, then the list. No stops. Same as everyone." Daniela walked to the bench. She did not sit at once. She stood over the keys the way her mother used to stand over a sinkful of dishes, with the patience of a person who knows the work is going to take exactly as long as it takes. Then she did something the crowd did not understand. She reached down and adjusted the bench, lower than every player before her had set it, and slid it back 2 inches and sat. She did not rub her hands. She did not flex. She laid them flat on her thighs, and she closed her eyes and she breathed once all the way down, and 400 people watched a fry cook breathe and did not know they had stopped breathing with her. Then she began. The cadenza of the Rachmaninoff does not start loud. It starts like a question asked in an empty house. The first phrase came out of the Steinway, so quiet that people leaned in, and the leaning in made the silence deeper, and into that deepening silence the notes began to gather and climb. Joanna Pike, in the press box, stopped narrating into her phone around the 8th bar. She just let it record. She would write later that she had heard the piece played by 3 of the great living virtuosos, and that not one of them had made the opening sound like a person remembering their mother. She had no way to know how close that was to true. Daniela's hands were burned in 3 places and fast as falling water, and they moved over the keys of a piano she had never touched in a hall she had never entered, and the music that came out was not a performance. It was a homecoming. Every midnight at the kitchen table with the silent paper keys, every Tuesday in the Methodist church with the 2 dead notes, every night in the conservatory practice rooms, while richer students slept, all of it was in her hands at once. And the wall that had stopped 11 players was not a wall to her. It was a door, and she had been standing in front of it her whole life with the key already in her pocket. She reached the cadenza's peak, the part where the doctoral candidate's hands had locked, and she did not slow, and she did not push. She let it crest and break and roll down into the transition, and the crowd, which had spent all night watching people fall off cliffs, understood somewhere in the chest before the mind that this one was not going to fall. The list followed without a seam. It was faster, crueler, a piece built to expose any hand that wasn't ready, and Daniela's hands were ready. There was a passage near the middle where the left hand has to do the impossible thing of being 2 voices at once, and she did it. And a man in the 2nd row who actually understood what he was hearing made a sound, an involuntary, "Oh!" the kind of sound you make when you see something you didn't think was real. Up at the podium, Preston Harrington had stopped angling his watch toward the light. He was holding the edge of the lectern with both hands. The 2 judges who had been murmuring were no longer murmuring. One of them, an old conductor named Solomon, who had not been moved by anything in a long time, had taken off his glasses and was holding them in his lap and looking at the girl on the stage with the open face of a child. Daniela played the final passage of the list with her eyes closed. She did not look at the keys, and she did not look at the crowd, and she did not look at Preston. The last chord came down full and certain, and she held it. Both hands pressed into the keys, letting the sound bloom and swell and finally fade up into the high glass of the hall until there was nothing left of it but the memory of it, ringing in 400 chests at once. The silence after was the loudest thing in the building. Nobody moved. The girl sat with her hands still on the keys and her eyes still closed, and for a moment it was just her and the instrument and whatever she was saying to it that none of them could hear. Then Ruth Calloway, in the third row, put her hands together and clapped. Once. The sound cracked across the hall like something breaking open. Theo the usher clapped next. Then Joanna in the press box, who was supposed to be impartial and had stopped caring. Then the man in the feed store cap. Then the woman in pearls who had watched Daniela change her shoes in the restroom mirror. Then a whole row, then a section, then the dam gave way entirely and 400 people came up out of their seats in a roar that put a physical pressure on the chest. The old conductor Solomon was on his feet with his glasses still in his hand and tears running plainly down his face and no shame about it at all. Daniela opened her eyes. She stood up from the bench. She did not bow right away. She looked out at the standing, roaring hall, and then she looked directly at Preston Harrington, who had not moved from the lectern, and she gave him the eye contact she had not given anyone all night. Preston had a microphone in his hand and nothing to say into it. He had spent 34 years certain he knew the difference between people who belonged in his hall and people who came in the freight elevator, and that certainty was draining out of his face in front of the cameras and 400 witnesses. There was no joke that could fix this. There was no warming the room at her expense, because the room was hers now entirely, and everyone in it, including Preston, knew it. He did the only thing left to a man whose every other door has closed. He honored the prize. He reached into his jacket for the foundation checkbook his lawyers had told him to stop carrying to these events, and his grandfather had told him 40 years ago to never be without. His hand was not steady. He wrote the date. He wrote the amount. He wrote Daniela Reyes on the pay-to line, and he had to ask her how to spell it, and she told him, and the way the room went quiet, to hear her spell her own name was its own kind of verdict. He tore the check along a perforation and held it out over the edge of the stage. Daniela walked over and took it. She did not look at the number. She folded it once and held it in her hand, and she stepped to the microphone Preston had abandoned on the lectern, and she spoke for the second time that night, just loud enough for the front rows and the cameras. My mother cleaned churches, she said. She used to drop me off at one with a piano nobody played. It had 2 dead keys. She paused, and the hall held it. For years I thought those dead keys were the problem. Turned out they taught me to hear the notes that weren't there. Another pause. Some of you drove past people tonight on the way here. People with signs. People at bus stops. You don't know what's in their hands. She stepped back from the microphone. She did not wait for the noise. She walked to the edge of the stage, picked up the plastic grocery bag with her work shoes inside, and she carried it down the steps the way another person might carry a trophy, because to her it was won. Joanna Pike's recording went up that night and had 2 million views before sunrise. Her written piece, The Notes That Weren't There, ran a week later on 3 national sites and got her hired back by the paper that had let her go, on her own terms, in writing. The old conductor Solomon called Daniela personally the next morning and offered to take her on, no fee, for as long as she wanted to learn from him, and she said yes. And she kept working the breakfast shift for 4 more months anyway, because the Bluebird had fed her when nothing else would, and she did not believe in leaving people who'd been good to her in a hurry. Marcus, the line cook, framed her entry form. He hung it by the register, the one that had ridden in her apron for 14 days, and under it he taped a card that said, in his 19-year-old handwriting, she was here first. Preston Harrington quietly canceled the competition the following year. The official statement said the foundation was redirecting its mission. What it actually did, under pressure from a board that had watched the footage and the headlines, was endow a fund in the name of a fry cook to put real pianos into schools and churches in the Rio Grande Valley. The kind of pianos with no dead keys, so the next kid with restless hands wouldn't have to learn to hear what wasn't there. Preston's name was on the press release once. After that, the story belonged to someone else, and for a man like Preston, that was the worst sentence anyone could have handed him. Daniela went back to that Methodist church a year later, the one with the bus stop out front. The old pastor had passed, but the piano was still there, still with its 2 dead keys, because nobody had ever had the money to fix it. She sat down, and she played it anyway, dead keys and all, and a handful of kids who'd wandered in off the street to get out of the heat sat on the floor and listened to a woman make a broken instrument sound like the most whole thing in the world. So the next time the radio tells you that some wall is impossible, that nobody's gotten past it in 6 years, remember that the person who finally does might be flipping your eggs that very morning. And the next time someone walks into your room in the wrong shoes, look at their hands before you decide where they belong, because the world is full of people who learned to hear the notes that weren't there, and most of them are still waiting for somebody to stop laughing long enough to listen. I keep coming back to the bench, not the check, not the roar, not Preston Harrington's face going white at his own lectern. The bench, the way Daniela Reyes lowered it 2 inches before she played a single note because she had spent 4 hours in the back row learning a piano she wasn't allowed to touch. That small, patient thing told me everything about how she got there. Nothing in that hall happened by luck. It happened because of 1,000 midnights at a paper keyboard taped to a kitchen table, 1,000 silent scales played for nobody, years of work that no one clapped for because no one was watching. That's the part people miss when they tell these stories. They want the miracle, but there was no miracle. There was a girl who kept her hands sharp in the dark for 5 years on the chance that a door might open, and when it cracked an inch, she was ready to walk through it. The talent was real, sure. Talent is cheap, though. The world is full of gifted people who quit the first time a room laughed at them. What Daniela had that the others didn't was the refusal to put the music down, even when keeping it cost her sleep, money, pride, and every reason to feel foolish. And here's the thing I can't shake. She could have humiliated Preston. She had the whole room. One cruel sentence and 400 people would have torn him apart for her. Instead, she talked about her mother cleaning churches, about 2 dead keys, about the people you drive past without seeing. She used her one open microphone to hand the crowd a mirror instead of a weapon. That choice is why the story outlived the night. Cruelty would have made her even with him. Mercy made her bigger than him. So when I think about what I'd want my own kids to take from this, it isn't practice piano. It's 3 things tangled together so tight you can't pull them apart. Do the work when no one is watching, because the work is what's in your hands the day your name finally gets called. Be the kind of person who tells the cool man to stop, like Ruth Calloway standing up in the 3rd row, and the kind who chooses dignity over revenge when you finally win. And learn to see, really see, the cook flipping your eggs, the woman changing her shoes in the restroom mirror, the kid with restless hands and a broken instrument, because the next Daniela Reyes is standing somewhere right now in the wrong shoes, waiting for one person to stop laughing long enough to listen. I think that's why I can't let it go. We've all been the one laughing without meaning to. And we've all, at some point, been the one walking down the aisle in the wrong coat, certain the whole room had already decided who we were. The hopeful thing is that it only takes one Ruth, one person willing to stand and say enough to change which one of those you become.